I never thought everything would fall apart so suddenly. One glance, and my past, present, and future went up in flames like dry paper in a fire. But do you know what's the scariest part? I wasn't ready for the truth. My name is Emily. At first glance, I'm just an ordinary girl. Work, friends, habits, dreams. But if only you knew how many secrets I've locked away. No one could ever truly see into my soul, no matter how hard they tried. At least, that's what I believed. It all started like any other day. A simple morning, nothing unusual. I was home alone. Just a minute ago, I was smiling at my reflection in the mirror, adjusting my hair, thinking this day would be as boring as the rest. And then I heard it. A sound. Barely audible, but enough to make me freeze. At first, I thought it was the wind. The living room window was often left slightly open. But it wasn't the wind. It was footsteps. Slow, careful, as if someone was trying not to be noticed. My heart began to race. Who's there? My voice was too loud in the silence. No answer came. But in that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. I stepped into the hallway. Everything looked as it always did. But something was wrong. You know that feeling, when you sense someone is watching you? That's exactly how I felt. The tension in the air grew thicker with every passing second. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was all in my head. And then I saw the bedroom door. It was slightly open. I distinctly remembered closing it. I stood a few steps away, staring at the floor, where something red caught my eye. A piece of fabric. My blouse. It had been neatly folded on the chair the night before. Now it lay on the floor, as if someone had dropped it. I took a step closer, then another. My mind raced with questions. Who could have done this? Why? My fingers touched the edge of the door, and I slowly pushed it open. That's when I saw him. He was sitting on the bed. In his hands, my diary. The one where I poured out everything I couldn't say aloud. All my fears, desires, dreams, and photos. What are you doing? My voice trembled, but he didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on a page, as if he were spellbound. As if he was seeing something I couldn't. When he finally looked up, my knees almost gave out. It wasn't the look of someone who regretted being caught. It was the look of someone who knew. Someone who understood me better than I understood myself. I was looking for answers, he said. His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it that made my skin crawl. My hands balled into fists. You had no right. I tried to grab the diary, but he lifted it out of reach, almost defensively. Why are you hiding this, Emily? Why are you so afraid of someone knowing the truth? His words cut through me like a knife. The truth? What truth? What could he possibly have discovered in my writings? And why did I feel like he now knew more about me than I did? Give it back, I demanded, my voice cold. But he just smirked. You know, Emily, sometimes fear is just a mask. And sometimes, it's the only thing keeping us alive. I didn't know what he meant. But deep down, I felt this was just the beginning of something far bigger. Something terrifying. That morning, I thought I had everything under control. But now I understood, my life would never be the same. And you know what? Deep inside, I feared he was right. If I had known what was coming, I never would have opened that door. But there was no turning back now. The diary was my only sanctuary. It was like a secret friend, someone who would never judge or betray me. I poured everything into it, my thoughts, fears, desires, and things I was too scared to admit even to myself. But beyond the words, there were photos. Intimate. Personal. Pictures I had taken in moments when I felt free and true to myself. No one was ever meant to see them. It was my little world, locked away and hidden. And yet, there he was of my stepfather, sitting on my bed with that diary in his hands. I couldn't understand how he'd found it. I always kept it tucked away in the drawer under my bed, buried beneath a pile of old clothes. I had made sure no one would ever find it. But he did. And now he sat there, holding my soul bare and defenseless. To be honest, our relationship had never been perfect. He was caring. Too caring. Always ready to help when I needed it, always finding time for me, even when I didn't ask. But there was something odd about it. Sometimes his attention felt misplaced, and his looks lingered for just a bit too long. As a child, I thought it was just my imagination. Back then, I believed adults simply looked at the world differently, not like my friends or peers. But as I got older, I began to notice how his gaze made me uncomfortable. It was as if he could see through me, see more than I ever wanted anyone to. Once, his eyes stayed on me for longer than they should have. I remember laughing nervously to hide my unease and asking, "Why are you looking at me like that?" He shrugged and said, "You're growing up." That's always a little strange. Those words stuck with me. At the time, I didn't think much of them, but now they sounded different. Now I remembered how often he'd found excuses to be alone with me. How much he knew about me that he shouldn't have known. And now he sat there with my diary, as though he was about to read every one of my thoughts aloud. "You'd be surprised how much you can learn about someone just by reading what they write," he said without looking up from the page. I stood in the doorway, frozen, not knowing what to say or do. My body felt like it had turned to stone. The only thought racing through my mind was, how much did he read? What pages had he seen? What did he now know about me that I would never have willingly shared? "Why did you do this?" My voice came out quieter than I expected. But he finally looked up at me, and the expression in his eyes made it feel like I was the one who had done something wrong. "You know," he said, "sometimes we keep too many secrets. And sometimes, those secrets start to destroy us." His words sounded as if he wanted to protect me. But I didn't need his protection. I wanted him to leave. I wanted him to hand me my diary and forget he'd ever found it. Instead, he closed the book, rested it on his lap, and added, "I wonder how long you planned on keeping all this hidden from everyone." His words felt like a challenge. But I had no idea what he was implying. He knew too much, more than I was ready to admit. At that moment, I understood, this wasn't just an awkward encounter. This was the beginning of something that would change everything. I should have said something. Anything. I should have snatched the diary from his hands and stormed out of the room. But I didn't. I froze. My feet felt glued to the floor, my breath caught somewhere between my lungs and throat. He looked at me, not with guilt or embarrassment, but with something else entirely. It wasn't defiance, no, it was worse. It was as if he was daring me, testing me. His expression carried a challenge I didn't understand but couldn't ignore. "You're more afraid of yourself than you are of me," he said calmly, his words sharp and deliberate, like a knife sliding into my chest. The room seemed to shrink around me. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. What did he mean by that? How could he say something so piercing, so personal? For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. The diary. It was still in his hands, closed now, but its presence felt like a living thing in the room, a shadow that loomed over both of us. "How long have you been reading it?" I managed to whisper, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. He tilted his head slightly, studying me with an unsettling calmness. "Long enough," he said. "Long enough to understand you better than you understand yourself." I felt like I was unraveling, my thoughts spinning out of control. My diary wasn't just a book, it was a piece of me, a place where I'd spilled my deepest fears, desires, and secrets. If he'd read even a fraction of it. "Why would you do this?" My voice cracked, the trembling in my hands betraying the anger I was trying to muster. "Why would you invade my privacy like that?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his fingers resting on the edges of the diary as if it were a precious artifact. "You shouldn't leave things so exposed if you don't want them to be found," he said finally, his tone infuriatingly nonchalant. "Exposed?" I snapped, the anger finally breaking through my fear. I hid it. I made sure no one could find it. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, and I hated him for it. You hid it where you thought no one would look, he said. But I knew. I've always known. His words sent a chill down my spine. Always known? What did he mean by that? How could he have known? I don't understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned forward then, his gaze locking onto mine. You've always had a way of revealing yourself, Emily. Even when you think you're hiding, you leave clues. Little breadcrumbs for someone willing to follow. I felt my knees weaken as his words sank in. He wasn't just talking about the diary. He was talking about me, about my entire life. How much had I let slip without even realizing it? How long had he been watching, piecing things together? You had no right, I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. Maybe not, he said with a shrug. But you can't deny that part of you wanted to be seen. To be understood. I shook my head, trying to deny it, trying to push his words out of my mind. But a small, treacherous part of me wondered if he was right. Give it back, I said finally, my voice steadier now, though my hands still shook. He held the diary out, just within my reach, but when I stepped forward to take it, he pulled it back. Not yet, he said. There's still more for me to learn. My breath caught in my throat again. You're sick, I said, my voice laced with disgust. Maybe, he said, unbothered by my words. Or maybe I just see you for who you really are. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran out of the room, my heart racing and my mind spinning. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. Away from his words, his eyes, and the terrifying truth they seemed to hold. But even as I fled, I knew this wasn't the end. Whatever had just started between us, it wasn't over. And deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted it to be. Every evening, I tried to avoid his gaze, but no matter how hard I tried, he always found a way to linger nearby. His presence was suffocating, yet it carried a strange magnetism I couldn't explain. He didn't act guilty or ashamed, as I had hoped he might. Instead, he seemed calm. Too calm. His comments, subtle but deliberate, always left me uneasy. Sometimes it was just a phrase, a passing remark that seemed innocent on the surface. But then the words would echo in my mind, and I would realize they sounded eerily familiar. They were pieces of my own thoughts, fragments pulled from the pages of my diary. How much had he read? How deeply had he dived into my mind? The realization that he knew parts of me I hadn't even shared with myself made my stomach churn. Nice dress, he said one evening as I passed him in the hallway. His tone was casual, almost absent-minded, but there was a weight to his words that made my skin crawl. I couldn't tell if he was genuinely complimenting me or reminding me of something I'd written. It was exhausting. Every interaction with him felt like walking a tightrope, unsure of when or how I might fall. And yet, there was something else. A feeling I hated myself for acknowledging. His attention, as invasive as it was, made me feel seen. Not for who I pretended to be, but for the raw, messy version of myself I kept hidden. At night, when I was alone in my room, I would replay our conversations in my head. I tried to convince myself that I was just overthinking, that his words didn't mean what I thought they did. But the truth gnawed at me, a quiet whisper I couldn't silence. He knows me too well. And then came the guilt. The shame. The sickening realization that a part of me didn't want to escape his gaze. A part of me craved it. One night, as I sat on my bed, staring blankly at my reflection in the mirror, there was a knock at my door. 3 soft, deliberate taps. My breath caught in my throat. It was late, too late for casual conversation. I stayed silent, hoping he would go away. Emily, his voice came from the other side, steady and calm. We need to talk. His tone sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't a request, it was a statement. I hesitated, my fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. It's late, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I know, he replied, his voice unshaken. But this can't wait. I glanced at the clock on my bedside table. The glowing numbers seemed irrelevant now, drowned out by the pounding of my heart. Go to bed, I said, trying to sound firm. But even I could hear the tremor in my voice. There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought he might listen. But then the doorknob turned. It was locked, thankfully, but the sound sent a jolt of fear through me. Emily, he said again, this time softer, almost pleading. You can't keep avoiding this. You can't keep avoiding me. I stayed frozen, unsure of what to do. My mind raced with possibilities. Should I open the door and face him? Should I shout, demand he leave me alone? Or should I stay silent and hope he would eventually walk away? I'm not angry, he continued, his voice low and measured. I just want to help you. You know that, don't you? Help me? The words felt like a trap, but I couldn't deny the flicker of doubt that crept into my mind. What if he really meant it? What if he was the only person who could understand me, no matter how twisted the circumstances? But then I remembered the diary. The invasion. The smirk on his face when he said he'd always known. No, I said finally, my voice firmer this time. I don't want to talk. Go away. There was another pause, longer this time. I could hear the faint sound of his breathing through the door, steady and controlled. All right, he said at last, his tone unreadable. Good night, Emily. I didn't move until I heard his footsteps retreating down the hall. Even then, I stayed frozen, my chest tight with fear and confusion. What did he want from me? Why couldn't he leave me alone? And why, deep down, did a small part of me not want him to? That evening, I knew it was going to happen. I could feel it in the air, in the way he looked at me during dinner, in the tension that hung between us like an unspoken secret. There was no point in pretending anymore. We had crossed an invisible line long ago, and tonight it felt like the final barrier was crumbling. I stayed in my room, staring blankly at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that I could stop this. That I should stop this. But every argument I made felt hollow, every attempt to pull myself back from the edge felt weaker than the pull drawing me toward him. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. My heart sank, yet my body betrayed me, tensing with anticipation. Emily, his voice called softly, almost gently, as if he already knew I wouldn't tell him to leave. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The sound of the doorknob turning sent a shiver down my spine, but this time it wasn't locked. He stepped inside, his movements careful and deliberate, as though he didn't want to startle me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of his gaze was unbearable, yet I couldn't bring myself to look away. I just want to talk, he said, his voice calm, soothing even. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was agreement or resignation. He closed the door behind him, the soft click echoing in the quiet room. He sat down on the edge of my bed, leaving a careful space between us. You don't have to be afraid, he said. I'm not afraid, I replied, though it wasn't entirely true. Fear was there, buried beneath a confusing swirl of other emotions, curiosity, shame, and something I didn't want to name. He reached out, his hand brushing mine. The touch was so light, so tentative, that it almost didn't feel real. I didn't pull away. You've always been so guarded, he said quietly, his thumb tracing the back of my hand. Even with yourself. My breath hitched. His words struck a chord deep within me, a place I had kept locked away for years. I wanted to argue, to deny it, but I couldn't. He wasn't wrong. I see you, Emily, he continued, his voice soft but firm. I see everything you're afraid to show the world. And it's beautiful. Tears stung at the corners of my eyes, though I didn't know why. His words felt like a mixture of comfort and a violation, as if he was reaching into the deepest parts of me and pulling them into the light. He shifted closer, closing the space between us. His hand moved to my cheek, his touch warm and steady. You don't have to hide from me, he said. I should have pushed him away. I should have stood up and walked out of the room. But I didn't. I couldn't. The walls I had built around myself felt like they were crumbling, and I was too tired to hold them up anymore. When his lips brushed mine, it was gentle, hesitant, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. I didn't. The kiss deepened, and for a moment, the world around us faded away. Every rational thought in my mind screamed at me to stop, but my body wouldn't listen. His touch was intoxicating, and I felt myself melting into him, surrendering to a force I didn't fully understand. The room felt impossibly quiet, the only sound the soft rhythm of our breaths. His hands moved carefully, reverently, as though I were something fragile, something he was afraid to break. And then it happened. I didn't stop him. I couldn't. In that moment, all the lines I had drawn for myself disappeared, and there was nothing left but us. Afterward, the silence in the room was deafening. I sat on the edge of the bed, my arms wrapped around myself as I tried to process what had just happened. He reached out, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. Was I okay? What did that even mean anymore? I didn't look at him. I couldn't. The weight of what we had done pressed down on me, and I felt like I was suffocating. "This changes everything," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "It doesn't have to," he replied, his tone calm but insistent. But he was wrong. It had already changed everything. There was no going back, no undoing what we had done. He stood, his movements careful and deliberate, as though he was afraid of breaking the fragile silence between us. "Good night, Emily," he said softly before leaving the room. I didn't respond. I sat there, staring at the closed door, my mind a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't untangle. Shame. Confusion. And something else I couldn't name. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. It couldn't be. Morning came, but it felt like a dream, a dark, twisted dream I couldn't wake up from. The sunlight poured through the windows, golden and warm, but it didn't reach me. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring blankly at the wall, trying to piece together what had happened. It felt surreal. Last night had been a storm of emotions, a collision of fear, desire, and something darker. But this morning? He was calm. Too calm. I heard the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen. He was there, acting as though nothing had happened, as though the world hadn't shifted beneath our feet. I wanted to stay in my room, lock the door, and pretend it was all a nightmare. But I couldn't. Not with him out there. My diary was still missing. That thought alone was enough to force me out of bed. I had to find it. I had to get it back. When I entered the kitchen, he was at the table, casually sipping coffee. The sight of him, so composed and unbothered, sent a wave of nausea through me. How could he act like this? Didn't he feel what I felt? He looked up, meeting my eyes with that same unreadable expression that both terrified and enraged me. "Morning," he said, his tone neutral, almost pleasant. I didn't respond. My eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of the diary. But he knew. Of course, he knew. "Looking for something?" he asked, setting his mug down with deliberate ease. "Where is it?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound strong. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "Where is what?" "You know what." My frustration bubbled over, and I slammed my hands on the table. "Give it back." His lips curled into a smirk, a subtle but infuriating gesture that made my blood boil. "The diary?" he asked, feigning innocence. "Yes." I shouted. "It's mine, and you had no right." "I had every right," he interrupted, his tone calm but laced with an edge that sent chills down my spine. "You left it where anyone could find it. You wanted someone to find it. Don't pretend otherwise." His words hit me like a slap. I opened my mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes silenced me. He was in control, and he knew it. "Emily," he said, his voice softer now, almost condescending. "You can't hide from yourself forever. That diary isn't just a collection of your thoughts. It's you. The real you. And now, he paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Now I have it. I felt my stomach drop. He wasn't just holding on to my secrets, he was holding on to me. Every vulnerable thought, every intimate confession, every dark fantasy I had buried in those pages, they were his now. You can't do this, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Do what? He asked, tilting his head slightly. Tell the truth? Show you who you really are? I clenched my fists, anger and desperation swirling inside me. Give it back, I repeated, but this time my voice lacked conviction. He stood then, slowly, deliberately, and took a step toward me. My heart raced, but I forced myself to hold my ground. You like this, don't you? He said, his voice low and calculated. Being weak. Being exposed. It's why you wrote those things in the first place. You wanted someone to see you for who you really are. That's not true, I shot back, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. Isn't it? He challenged, his smirk deepening. I took a step back, the weight of his presence overwhelming. I felt trapped, like a puppet in his hands, every string pulled with precision. But then something shifted. A spark of defiance ignited within me, small but growing. He had taken so much already, my privacy, my dignity, my sense of control. I couldn't let him take more. Give it to me, I said again, this time with a steadiness I didn't know I had. His expression faltered for a brief moment, just long enough to confirm what I had suspected. He wasn't invincible. He could be challenged. Or what? He asked, recovering quickly. What will you do, Emily? I didn't answer. Instead, I moved, fast and without thinking. I reached for the drawer where he had glanced moments earlier, pulling it open and rummaging through its contents. Stop, he said sharply, but I didn't listen. My hands found the leather-bound edges of the diary, and I yanked it free. For a split second, relief washed over me. But then his hand closed around my wrist, firm and unyielding. Let go, I said, my voice trembling but determined. His grip tightened, and his eyes bore into mine, filled with something I couldn't name. You don't understand, do you? He said, his voice dangerously quiet. This isn't just about the diary. This is about us. There is no us, I spat, yanking my arm free. He stepped back, his smirk returning. If that's what you want to believe, he said, his tone almost mocking. But you'll come back. You always do. I clutched the diary to my chest, my heart pounding as I backed away. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The room felt suffocating, his presence overwhelming, but I had what I came for. As I fled back to my room and locked the door behind me, I realized something important. He was right about one thing, I had left breadcrumbs. I had let him in, little by little, until he had taken control. But now I had my secrets back. And with them, a weapon. This wasn't over. Not yet. I wrote everything down one last time. Every detail, every feeling, every thought that had haunted me since this began. The diary had been my weakness, my vulnerability. But now it was my weapon. The pages were no longer just a reflection of my fears, they were a mirror, one I would force him to look into. He thought he controlled me, but he didn't realize I had already slipped free from his grasp. That morning, I left the diary open on the kitchen table, exactly where he drank his coffee every day. The sight of it there, exposed, gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. This time, it wasn't hidden. This time, I wanted him to find it. I didn't pack much, just a small bag with essentials. My hands trembled as I zipped it closed, not from fear, but from adrenaline. The thought of what would happen when he read those pages filled me with equal parts terror and exhilaration. There, on the table, he would find everything. Not just what had happened between us, but the truth about him. About the way he looked at me, the way he lingered too long, the way he crossed every boundary without a second thought. And he would find something more, a letter. The words were simple, but I knew they would hit him like a blade. I've written everything down. If you ever come near me again, this truth will destroy you. Maybe it still will. I didn't wait to see his reaction. I couldn't. By the time he sat down to drink his coffee, I was already miles away, the morning sun rising behind me as I drove. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The weight of his presence, his manipulation, was finally lifting. I didn't know where I was going, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was that I was free. But as the miles stretched out before me, so did the questions. What would he do? Would he destroy the diary, pretend it never existed? Or would he try to chase me, to pull me back into his web? I couldn't know. And maybe I didn't want to. A small part of me, a part one hated, wondered if he was reading it now. If his hands were trembling the way mine had when I wrote those final words. If he realized, at long last, that he had lost. The road ahead was empty, stretching into the unknown. My heart was heavy, but it beat with a new rhythm now. A rhythm of survival. Of strength. Of something I couldn't name yet, but I knew it was mine. And yet, as I drove, I couldn't help but glance at the passenger seat, where a single page of the diary rested. The one I had torn out. The one I kept for myself. Because the truth wasn't just for him. It was for me too. As the screen fades to black, a single sentence appears. Would you leave your truth behind or take it with you?